welcome back to my channel. My name's Cole Anderson. Today I'm going somewhat against my usual habit once again. I'm talking about one of the most famous and arguably overplayed pieces in the entire piano repertoire, Beethoven's so-called Moonlight Sonata, the sonata in C-sharp minor, opus 27, number 2. Beethoven's own subtitle for this sonata was Quasi una fantasia. So yes, the title Moonlight is not original. Beethoven very rarely gave programmatic titles to his pieces. It was Ludwig Rellstab who coined the famous title in 1832, well after Beethoven's death, by comparing the first movement to Moonlight on the Waves of Lake Lucerne. And personally, I'm not too much offended by this title. It's really up to each individual listener to decide if it means anything to them personally. It is interesting to note that the inspiration for this movement originally was a short segment from Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, A Soccorso son tradito, which is a short trio after the duel between the Commendatore and Don Giovanni when the Commendatore is dying. So the original inspiration was really something much more funereal and dirge-like, but beyond that, I think it's really up to each person's own imagination to decide what they feel about this movement. This wasn't the only time, of course, that Beethoven modeled something in his music on Mozart. Just look at the start of his C minor concerto and compare it to Mozart's concerto in the same key. This piece has been insanely popular pretty much from the day it was published back in 1801. In fact, its enormous popularity during Beethoven's lifetime caused a lot of chagrin for him. He felt that it unjustly overshadowed much more refined and complex later works that he had composed, which is really perhaps true. Even though this sonata is a masterwork, it's a relatively simple and straightforward construction when you get right down to it. In many ways, the other sonata, Quasi una fantasia, the other sonata from this opus 27, opus 27 number 1, is every bit as groundbreaking as the Moonlight in its own way. It's just not quite as obviously dramatic, and so it doesn't get played as much, and its structural and musical ingenuity is usually overlooked. And it's definitely easy to understand why this work is so popular. It really encapsulates an approach to form that is part improvisatory and partly drawn from a unashamedly dramatic rendering of sonata form, which really pointed directly to the future of music, what was going to be coming in the 19th century. No wonder this piece has been so gripping for so many people, and also for me as well, actually. This piece is a very special one for me. It was this recording of it by the legendary Vladimir Horowitz that was one of my earliest inspirations in the piano world. I remember just being absolutely mesmerized by this piece and the other sonatas on the album. I listened to them again and again. I can say with some certainty that if I had not ever heard that album, I would probably not be a musician today, or at least I wouldn't be a pianist. And as is usually the case, I can't help but have mixed feelings about the excessive popularity of this work. It's a masterwork, there's no doubt about it. It's one of those pieces, though, that's so popular, it's been played so often over the years, that there's this performance tradition that's developed, particularly as regards the tempo in the first movement. And it's really probably totally erroneous what people have done usually. Usually the first movement is played at this tempo. And don't get me wrong, there's many very effective and beautiful performances at that speed. The only problem is that it's probably not what Beethoven had in mind, really. Beethoven indicates an adagio, and the time signature is alla breve. That's the C with the line through it. And an alla breva means, in essence, that the time signature should be 2 half notes rather than 4 quarter notes. And you might ask, if you know something about music theory, isn't that the same thing? 4 quarter notes equals 2 half notes. It all adds up to the same number of beats. And that's true. However, the notion of the alla breva actually suggested a different kind of psychological approach to the performance. And this is something that would have been instinctively understood by Beethoven's contemporaries. Thinking in 2 larger beats per bar obviously causes you to take a faster tempo than if you were beating 4 beats in a bar. But at the same time, it actually causes the feeling of the tempo to be slower to the performer, from the performer's perspective, owing to the sensation of these 2 larger beats. It encourages a feeling of a longer line and a smoother, less agitated kind of delivery. I think that the character of this movement in particular changes markedly when you play it with the alla breva in mind. Again, it was widely understood by musicians in the 18th century that alla breva could indicate a more flowing tempo. So anywhere from slightly faster than a 4/4 to twice as fast, and anything in between. It was really just this difference in feeling and this kind of psychological approach to the music. And it's very important, I think, in regards to this movement because it also encourages a more kind of improvisatory approach. If your main tempo is faster, then you have much more room for kind of pushing and pulling the rhythm, as opposed to this more kind of plodding, slower tempo, which really requires a more kind of steady, metrical kind of performance to be effective. And to me, this approach seems a little bit too heavy, too regular. Of course, this is a matter of opinion, and I don't want to give the wrong impression. There's many performances, including that one by Vladimir Horowitz, at the slower tempo, which are very beautiful. At any rate, though, this whole notion of the alla breva was sufficiently obscure by the time of the 1830s, so just like 30 years after the piece was written, to cause Beethoven's student, Carl Czerny, in his book on Beethoven interpretation, to suggest that one could find the correct tempo for the movement by imagining it to be an andante con moto in 4/4. So kind of a tempo conversion rate, in other words. And he's got a fair amount of criticism over the years for this kind of glib statement. Maybe it does seem kind of ridiculous on the face of it to say that an adagio should be felt like an andante. He was just trying to guide musicians about this kind of obscure point, though. I think alla breva notation was no longer really understood in this kind of subtle way that it was for Beethoven. I think by that time, alla breva just basically meant twice as fast, which was not the way that classical musicians really approached it in the 18th century. And this is only one point of contention in this movement. There's another big one, and it has to do with what Beethoven wrote at the very top of the first page of the sonata. Beethoven left a very interesting direction. He writes in Italian, "Si deve suonare tutto questo pezzo delicatessimamente e senza sordini," or basically, the whole piece should be played throughout very delicately and without dampers. Without dampers meaning with the pedal. This one statement about the pedal has left musicians for generations arguing about this sonata. So Czerny, who studied with Beethoven and knew him presumably pretty well, stated that although one should use the pedal continuously in this movement, you should change the pedal with each change of harmony. That's kind of a standard way of pedaling in the modern style. And it's how people have played this movement for a long time. It's a tradition, given that Beethoven didn't mark each individual pedaling, it just makes sense to change with each harmony. However, recently people have begun to wonder if Beethoven's marking actually means that the pedal was meant to be held continuously throughout the movement without changing it. So on a modern piano, it sounds like this. So that's pretty wild, right? And there's some precedent for this, actually. There's good reasons why people think this might be the case. There are places, many places, where Beethoven and his contemporaries specifically marked long pedals in which there's more than one harmony that gets mixed together. And this effect was easier to get. It works much better on the lighter, less resonant pianos that Beethoven was using. They were much smaller. They didn't accumulate resonance so quickly as modern pianos do. And you can still approximate this effect, though, on a modern piano. You just have to use some kind of careful half-pedaling, kind of half-changing the pedal more frequently. And there are a few famous and very beautiful examples in Beethoven's music, although we could point to many more also in the music of his contemporaries. So here's a few examples. And that last one from the C minor concerto is actually one that we also have a description of Czerny about, because Czerny described Beethoven playing this concerto in public and said that Beethoven actually held down the pedal for the entire opening without changing the pedal at all, and that this really worked very well on the pianos of the day. And in regard to this whole question of pedal, it's important to remember that before Beethoven and also characters like Dussek, one of Beethoven's contemporaries, the pedal was not used in the way it typically is today. The pedal was kind of a special effect. Nowadays we use the pedal all the time, pretty continuously, and we use it to aid with legato, with our fingers. But back in those days, that wasn't really common yet. And Beethoven and Dussek were really remarked upon in their day owing to this unusual way of using the pedal. They used it all the time, and aiding legato as well. Czerny also said that Beethoven used far more pedal in his works than he indicated. And when he did indicate pedaling, it was generally for this kind of special effect that we were talking about before, where the harmonies were going to be blurred together. So from all this, it does sound like Beethoven might have meant this opening movement to be played with continuous pedal, right? And after all that, I have to say, I really don't think so. And I have reasons for that as well, so here they are. First off, there's just documentary evidence. So our good friend Carl Czerny, who's very helpful in these matters, he was a major source for describing Beethoven's really extraordinary uses of the pedal, like in the C minor concerto. And he doesn't describe anything unusual about the way the pedal should be used in this movement. He just says that the pedal should be taken again with each new harmony. And you would imagine he probably would have mentioned it if Beethoven had been in the habit of holding the pedal throughout the entire piece. That would have been kind of remarkable. And if you really think about it, the Moonlight Sonata is musically quite different from the other examples that I just showed you. The harmonic rhythm is much faster than any of the other examples, unlike in the Tempest or the Waldstein, where there's a very slight, kind of pleasant blending of dissonant notes, but still plenty of time for excessive dissonance to fade away. In the Moonlight, the buildup of dissonance quickly becomes very overwhelming. It's kind of impossible to bear after a while. And this is even true on a forte piano from Beethoven's day also, those instruments which had much less resonance. I've heard several performances by fine artists who tried to get this effect on a contemporary piano from the day, and it still, to my mind, results in mush. Also, it generally forces the artists to take very slow tempos in an attempt to let the sound die away enough so that there's not excessive dissonance, and that really clashes with the idea of the alla breva, which Beethoven marks clearly and which Czerny specifically talked about in his commentary. Also, another point that's worth keeping in mind is that Beethoven had not yet reached the point of using the modern indication for pedaling. So usually you see something like this where it says PED and then there's a little asterisk where you're supposed to take the pedal off. Instead, in all of the sonatas up to this point, he was still using the old-fashioned method. He was writing out the full Italian phrase con sordini and senza sordini every time he wanted to show pedaling. And this is very cumbersome, obviously. But there were really so few passages where Beethoven needed to mark pedal that it worked fairly well. It wasn't a big deal. However, the Moonlight Sonata was the first case in his opus which could obviously be treated in the more modern way that Czerny described in Beethoven's performances anyway. In other words, pedaled continuously from beginning to end, changing the pedal with the harmonies. Now, this isn't to say that you couldn't have some blurred effects in this movement. In fact, I like to blur some things together. But there's several places in the movement, just from an interior musical standpoint, that really suggests strongly that the continuous pedal throughout is not what Beethoven had in mind. So take these two passages, for example. These passages, the way they're notated, strongly suggest that Beethoven intended a crescendo followed by a sudden drop to piano. And this is totally lost if you're holding the pedal through these bars. So I think at least in these passages, you need to have some kind of change of pedal. And it doesn't matter if it's on a modern piano or on a forte piano from Beethoven's day, it's the same, really. The same thing happens. So to my mind, Beethoven's indication at the beginning of this piece is really analogous to what Robert Schumann did in many of his works. He would just put a pedal marking at the start of the piece and nothing else, just showing that the piece should be pedaled normally. And no one would argue that those pieces should have the pedal held throughout, that you should just like put a book on the pedal and just play. But in Beethoven's case, they do, just because of Beethoven's use of blurred pedaling in other places. This is just an example of very well-meaning interpreters, very conscientious interpreters, taking Beethoven a little too literally at his word. And we'll see many more examples of this as we go through other Beethoven sonatas. In general, Beethoven was very precise in his markings, but there's sometimes still when he left questions for us to decipher. From the standpoint of form, both of these sonatas, Opus 27, depart quite noticeably from standard classical practice. First off, of course, there's simply the ordering of the movements. Instead of having a fast, assertive movement in sonata form to open this piece, we instead get this kind of ghostly, improvised adagio. More like a prelude than a clear statement. It does have the general outline of a sonata form, it doesn't quite satisfy the requirements really for a sonata in several important ways. First off, of course, it's monotextural. There's no shift in texture or break in sound when the second theme is introduced. Instead, you just have the same hypnotic accompaniment throughout. There's also no articulation of the exposition, no repeat of the exposition that would have been common at that time. Also, the piece harmonically kind of wanders in a really extraordinary way. The exposition does not go to any of the standard tonal destinations. Again, there's no real shift in mood from the first to second ideas either. So it's really much more of kind of a prelude of the musical ideas coming into focus gradually. There's no kind of clear statement that you would expect to see in a classical sonata. Then there's a very gentle and wistful minuet and trio, and then finally the finale, the presto. And it's with the finale where we finally get a really weighty, fully developed sonata form movement, what would usually have formed the first movement in a more standard form. Beethoven also draws a really interesting link between these movements. The arpeggios that open the last movement act as a connection to the arpeggio accompaniment from the first movement. And even beyond that, there's a number of interesting little thematic and harmonic connections between the outer movements, which I've marked in the score if you are interested in going a little deeper into that. It might be too much to say that this is really a cyclical work in the true sense of the word, like the Fifth Symphony, but it's obvious that Beethoven is moving in that direction, trying to connect the movements, whether that's through thematic means, harmonic means, or just through mood. And it's certainly true that these three movements go together in a really inexorable, remarkable way. That's not always the case up to that time in more loosely organized classical sonatas. It would be very hard to imagine splitting these movements up under any circumstances. There's such a dramatic narrative to how these three movements go together. So I hope you do enjoy the full performance of the piece. Please do hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment if you have any thoughts on any of the topics I brought up. And thank you to all of my supporters, financial supporters through Patreon and PayPal. I couldn't do it without you. If you haven't already become a patron of this channel, I do strongly encourage you to consider it if you can. You can follow the links in the description box below to become a patron through patreon.com, or you can make donations through PayPal. Any amount is really appreciated, and it will help me to put more focus into this channel. I'm really serious about that. Any amount, $1 a month, $5 a month, anything like that will help me a lot. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.